I read so many good books this year. Back in 2021, I set a goal of reading enough books that narrowing it down to 10 favorite books would be a difficult task. And I didn't achieve it last year, but this year we definitely did. I'm pretty happy with the list I came up with, but it was so hard to choose. So without further ado, here are my top 10 favorite books of the year and some honorable mentions at the end. First up is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. This is a good time to mention that there won't be any books on this list that are in the middle or at the end of a series. I'll always recommend you the first book in the series so that no matter which book on this list speaks to you, you can go pick it up right after this video. Mistborn is everything it's chalked up to be. It has an engaging plot, a fantastic magic system, and really interesting characters that are a lot of fun to follow. There's Kelsier, who's a charismatic peasant with golden retriever energy and a lust for spilling blood. There's Vin, who's been chewed up and spit out by Luthadil's underground crime scene at a young age, and an eclectic gang of magic users that are all tasked with the mission of pulling a heist on the Lord Ruler himself, who's like the Dark Lord, God Emperor of the world.
I'm kind of a big deal.
If you're just getting into fantasy, this is a great place to start. And if you're an experienced fantasy reader who still hasn't read this, you are missing out. What are you waiting for? The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. The Blade Itself is the first book in the first Law trilogy, and it has the iconic feeling of classic fantasy while being a modern take on it that feels really new and different. Abercrombie's known for creating really vivid, interesting characters that develop so much. I would say that they're morally gray, but they're really just written to be bad people. Abercrombie makes them super interesting to follow throughout the story, and oftentimes we find ourselves rooting for them even though we often wish we weren't. For example, one of my favorite characters is Inquisitor Glokta, who's essentially a torturer for the Royal Inquisition. He's got a death wish of his own and the matching dark sense of humor to go with it.
Is this how you get your sick kicks?
What? It's just an ordinary crabby.
Oh my goodness!
My other favorite character is Logan Ninefingers, who's this scarred, battle-worn northern warrior. He has hundreds of scores to settle and a desire to be a better man than he once was. If you couldn't already tell, The Blade Itself is grimdark fantasy, meaning that in pretty much every situation, a good deed never goes unpunished. This genre isn't for everyone, but if you're at all interested in it, this is a great place to start with the genre. Abercrombie uses the subgenre masterfully. His use of violence and gore is always really calculated and important to the plot. It's given the proper weight in the characters' lives, as I think it should be. The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. I finally read this. I grew up with the movies. I absolutely love watching those and rewatching them, and I'm just enamored by Middle-earth and the stories that are told within it. What made reading The Fellowship of the Ring so special is that I got to experience some of my favorite stories told in a completely different way at a different level of depth than I'd seen them on the screen.
I can't read it.
There are few who can.
One thing that helped is that I already know and love the movies, so I'm in no rush to figure out what happens at the end because, in general, I kind of know what happens. A lot of people, myself included, do recognize that these are very slow books as compared with the movies especially, but just even among other fantasy books. So not having that sense of urgency is really crucial to enjoying them. It turns a slog into a leisurely stroll.
One does not simply walk into Mordor.
Mort by Terry Pratchett. Mort is an absurdist fantasy novel set in Discworld. It's technically the 4th or 5th book in Discworld, but pretty much everyone has a different opinion on the proper Discworld reading order, and I happen to start with Mort. This book follows Mort, who's a farmer boy who becomes Death's apprentice. And I'm talking Death like the Grim Reaper Death. He teaches Mort how to bring a soul from life into the afterlife and the process of collecting souls in that way at the moment of a person's passing. Through this, Mort, the book, is able to explore mortality, the absurdity of life, and the indifference of the universe in a really special way. Hijinks ensue, the plot gets super interesting, the characters develop, and it's all woven into a story that's both deeply entertaining and insightful beyond words. Mort was ridiculously fun to read. Absurdism as a subgenre has a way of making me laugh and cry repeatedly, multiple times on a page. Nearly every line in this book is either witty or quotable in some way. I cannot wait to return to Discworld and read more of the Death books. The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. One of my reading goals for 2022 was to read more Ursula K. Le Guin. I had never read her before this year, and this is the book I jumped in with. This book takes place in Le Guin's Hainish universe, which is a universe that includes Earth, in which there are a bunch of human planets that were all seeded by one human population on the planet of Hain. Generations and generations later, all these planets are getting back in touch with each other. This is part of the Hainish Cycle series, but you really don't need to read them in order, and even Ursula Le Guin says that there's no real order. It follows Genly Ai, who's a man from Earth who's sent as an envoy to the planet of Gethin. His goal is to get Gethin to join this interplanetary ecumen that essentially links all the planets so that they can trade and communicate. Gethenians are completely androgynous people. They have a sexual cycle in which they are sexually active for 1 week out of the month, and in that time they could fulfill either the male or female role in sex and reproduction. After that period, they go back to being totally androgynous with no sexual parts or drive. And that's kind of the driving idea of the book. How does someone from Earth who has a pretty rigid idea of the sexual and gender binary interact with a world in which those things are literally inconceivable to them? That alone was enough to pique my interest, but this book does so much more than just explore that. This is chock full of political intrigue, survival, adventure, interplanetary travel and communication, character development, and deep friendships. Knowing that this was written in 1969, it seems way ahead of its time in a lot of regards, and it's not one that I see talked about on the internet a whole lot. Definitely worth reading if you're into classic sci-fi, gender theory, or just incredible storytelling. A Psalm for the Wild-Built by Becky Chambers. So I actually read this twice this year. A Psalm for the Wild-Built is solar punk utopian science fiction that takes place on a world where humans and robots have chosen to live separately from one another. At the start of the book, it's been 1,000 years since the robots left to go live in the wild. And we follow sibling Dex, who's a tea monk, as they go on their circuit around towns. We see Dex get restless in their day-to-day life and strive for something more, something that's different and exciting compared to their sort of everyday monotony. I can't get much more into detail about it without spoiling the plot, but suffice it to say, Dex goes on a journey that tugged at my heartstrings every time and got me super emotional, not in just a sadness way, but in just a really meaningful way.
No, Squidward, I meant good for your soul.
This is one of the best written, most concise books that I read this year. Every chapter does a boatload of thematic lifting without feeling like it's super theme heavy. If you're someone who's not feeling very clear about their path in life like me, or someone who just needs a hug, this book is one that you should definitely pick up. Next up is The Lathe of Heaven, also by Ursula K. Le Guin. There's so many sci-fi books that could go on this list, but the last one that I'll talk about here is The Lathe of Heaven. This short book is fast-paced and based on a really interesting premise. What if a person had dreams while they slept that physically altered the world upon waking? Our protagonist, George Orr, has this affliction where his dreams change reality and only he knows about it. That is until sleep psychologist Dr. Haber gets involved and tries to sort of manipulate George Orr and this power for his own benefit. That's where the plot starts unfolding. Like all of Le Guin's work, it's fantastically written and packed with thematic punch. This is one that I want to reread over and over just to get as much as I can out of it. Next book is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. Book Talk hyped this book up to the point where I was convinced it was going to be terrible. Usually when a book gets the level of hype that The Secret History did, it's usually overhyped. Not so with this one. This is one of the most hyped books on the internet, and I think that it is genuinely deserving of that hype. It blew my mind. First off, this is one of a handful of books that I picked up and immediately recognized just the quality of the writing. Tartt's prose is gorgeous without being flowery. It's beautiful in the way that a perfectly sharpened pencil is. It's precise and effective. The characters are fleshed out super well. They all felt so real, like I actually know them in real life or something. Even when they behave super unrealistically, they still feel very real. I loved and hated all of them, and all their layers and complexity showed in stark relief in every scene.
Onions have layers.
The plot was an absolute roller coaster. At no point did I know where this was going, and I loved that about it. This is another one that I read right at the right time. I was studying abroad in Prague. I was missing the New England winters. This takes place in Vermont at a small college. The descriptions of the setting and the way that the story is embedded in place brought me right back to New England. Really fantastic, and one that I will definitely be rereading at some point. Next up is In, a graphic novel by Will McPhail. I'm honestly really surprised that this this one made the list, but I just keep thinking back to it so often. I visited Edinburgh in March or April, and I found myself sitting in a bookstore for probably 2 or 2.5 hours just reading this book cover to cover. My apologies to the bookstore. I didn't end up buying it because, luggage. It has themes about loneliness and about making sense of a world in which deep connections are hard to come by. I think almost everyone would benefit from reading this. Next is The Will to Change by Bell Hooks. I don't think I've ever felt more seen as a man than through the work of Bell Hooks.
I am a man.
I went into it super skeptical, not really expecting to learn as much as I did, and it ended up feeling like a warm hug that I didn't know I needed. If you're not familiar, Bell Hooks is a gender theorist and cultural critic who spent her life making strides in the feminist movement, especially as it pertains to intersectionality and media. She's known for writing super accessible theory so that pretty much anyone who can read can pick up her books and understand her super high-level concepts. She makes it super digestible and honestly fun to read. I listened to the audiobook for this one, which I definitely recommend. The audiobooks are fantastic. While I think that everyone who interacts with men and boys could benefit from reading this, I particularly recommend it to men who feel excluded from feminism. Bell Hooks doesn't just present ideas for how to be an ally, she makes it clear the crucial role that men play in the feminist movement and details why we're necessary to that. I've never felt better about my place in it all after reading this book, and I feel like I'm finally seen by a movement that I've always sort of looked at and felt a bit outside of. Again, highly recommend. It'll change the way that you view and interact with the men in your life. Now time for honorable mentions. These books were so darn good, but just barely didn't make the cut. Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu, The Stranger by Albert Camus, The Trial by Franz Kafka, Humankind by Rucker Bregman, Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, and Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Ames. If any of those titles or covers catch your eye, definitely look into them. I loved them all. If you're interested in seeing the entire list of all 52 books that I read this year, click here to watch it next. If you made it to the end of the video, first of all, thank you so much. Second of all, I think you're a really good fit to be a subscriber of this channel. I make all kinds of book videos, and I'm looking to make some more in-depth analyses in 2023. So if that sounds interesting to you, make sure you follow along. Find me on my other socials, link in the description.